Out here in the Appalachians, the cabins don't just sit empty. They wait. Some were never meant to be found again. Others never truly let go of whoever stepped inside last. Tonight, we're diving deep into 10 of the most disturbing true Appalachian cabin horror stories, tales of isolation, disappearance, and things that knock after midnight when no one should be out there. Before we begin, tap that like button. It helps this story reach more horror fans like you. Comment where you're watching from, because every viewer is part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is tuning in from. And after the stories, drop a comment telling me which one haunted you the most. And don't forget to subscribe. It's a huge support for this channel, and helps us keep bringing you terrifying stories, week after week. Now let's begin. I rented the cabin for the quiet. That was the whole point. My job in Lexington had been eating me alive. Long hours. The constant hum of traffic, screens glaring late into the night. I wanted silence, or at least the kind of silence you only get in the mountains. The cabin was advertised as rustic but clean. The drive there was anything but. I followed a twisting road that cut along hollow valleys, fog rising like steam from the trees. My GPS lost signal 10 miles back, and the last sign of life I passed was a boarded-up gas station with a rusted Coca-Cola sign leaning against the wall. By the time I pulled up to the place, I felt like I had crossed some invisible line into another world. The cabin sat in a small clearing, wood blackened with age and rain. Moss had climbed halfway up the foundation stones, and the porch sagged as if it couldn't hold much weight. When I stepped out of the car, the air smelled of wet leaves and the faint sourness of rot, the way a basement smells when it's never been opened. Inside wasn't much better. The floorboards creaked under every step. Furniture was sparse, an old couch with stuffing peeking from one corner, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a single framed photograph on the wall. I looked closer at it. A family of 4 stood stiffly in front of the same cabin, years earlier, judging by their clothes. Their faces were pale from the flash, their eyes dull and unfocused, as if they hadn't wanted to be there. Someone had scratched a line through the father's face with a knife or nail. The first night, I cooked something simple on the small propane stove and sat by the window listening to the crickets. It should have been peaceful, but there was something oppressive in the silence between their chirps, like the woods were holding their breath. I fell asleep earlier than I expected. The bed upstairs was lumpy but dry. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the porch outside. I froze. Whoever it was wasn't knocking, wasn't rushing, just pacing, one side of the porch to the other. The boards creaked under their weight, then silence, then another step. I waited, straining to hear. My heart thudded against the mattress. After what felt like minutes, I forced myself up, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and crept downstairs. The lock was still bolted. I opened the door fast, shining the light out across the porch. Empty, just the fog pressing in, thicker than before. The woods whispered with leaves shifting in the breeze, but no one was there. I almost convinced myself I'd dreamt it until I lowered the flashlight beam to the porch floor. There, just outside the door, were muddy boot prints. Not mine. I had left my shoes by the couch, still dry from the drive. These prints were larger, heavy, the mud thick and fresh. I didn't sleep again that night. The second day, I tried to convince myself it was a hunter or hiker who got lost, but the cabin sat at the end of a rutted dirt path, with no trailheads nearby. I hadn't passed another vehicle for miles on the way in. Still, I stayed. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. The daylight made everything feel harmless. I walked a little around the property, though the ground sucked at my boots in patches of mud, and I never shook the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. That evening, I found a small drawer in the table. It stuck when I tried to open it, but after tugging hard, it slid free. Inside was a folded notebook, pages swollen from damp. Most of the writing had blurred, but I could still make out parts. One entry read, "He's out there again tonight. Won't come in. Just walks." I don't sleep anymore. The rest of the page was smudged, lines torn where the pen had pressed too hard. My stomach turned as I realized the handwriting wasn't neat or casual. It looked frantic, carved into the paper. That night, the pacing returned. I lay in bed, holding my breath. This time the steps came slower, heavier, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear. The boards groaned under their weight, stopping every few seconds like they were pausing at the door. I gripped the flashlight, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door again, not after reading that notebook. Not after realizing someone else had heard the same thing. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Eventually the steps faded, leaving me in silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. In the morning, when I finally went to the porch, I found more boot prints. They weren't just in front of the door now, they circled the cabin. Deep impressions in the mud, close to the walls, as if whoever it was had walked around and around while I lay awake inside. I left that afternoon, packed everything, and drove the winding road back to civilization, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. But here's the thing, it's been weeks, and I still hear it sometimes. In my apartment, far from those mountains, I'll wake in the dark to the faint creak of boards, the sound of someone pacing slowly outside my window, and when I look the next morning, even on the concrete balcony, there are footprints, muddy, heavy, not mine. I can't explain it, and I don't tell anyone. All I know is that silence isn't peaceful anymore. It's a warning. I'd been hiking alone for 2 days, somewhere along the edge of the Blue Ridge in western North Carolina. My plan was simple: leave the noise of Asheville behind, get off the marked trails, and just keep moving south along the ridgelines until my legs gave out. No deadlines, no cell service, just me, the wet smell of leaves rotting into the soil, and the constant hiss of wind rolling down the hollows. By late afternoon, fog had drifted in, clinging low between the trees. It wasn't the kind that sits still. It moved, slow currents of gray twisting between the trunks like smoke. My boots were damp, my pack heavier than it should have been, and every step forward sounded loud against the silence. That's when I saw it. Not a ranger's hut or a hunting shack, but a cabin, bigger than it should have been for this deep in. 2 stories, wood siding grayed with age, the roof sagging on one side. I wouldn't have noticed it if not for the door, hanging slightly open, rocking against its frame each time the wind pushed through. I don't know why I walked toward it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe the thought of sitting down on a real chair instead of a rock. The air smelled like wet pine and something else, something faint, sour, almost like milk that had been left too long. When I stepped inside, the world changed. The place looked alive, not abandoned, not gutted like the old farmhouses I'd passed on back roads before. On the table by the window, plates were set, food still sitting on them, bread torn in half, a bowl of beans, spoon left inside. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, though the hearth was cold. On the floor near the stairs lay a child's toy truck, paint chipped, wheels missing. A thin rug was bunched like someone had just walked across it. I remember whispering hello into the silence, like a fool, my voice swallowed instantly by the din. Nothing moved. Upstairs was worse. There were 2 bedrooms. In the first, quilts lay pulled halfway down the beds, like someone had thrown them off quickly. A pair of boots sat by the door, muddy, on the dresser, a brush still tangled with long hair. In the second room, the smell hit me strongest: warmth, sweat, the faint musk of bodies that had only just been there. I put my hand against the nearest bedspread. It wasn't just warm, it was alive with heat, like someone had gotten up minutes before I arrived. That's when my stomach dropped. I backed down the stairs, each creak of the boards sounding too sharp, too loud. I wanted to leave, to step back into the fog and forget I'd seen it. But I froze at the door frame, because the thing that stuck with me wasn't the food or the toys or even the beds. It was how natural it all looked, like a snapshot of life in motion. But there was no sound, no cicadas, no birds, No firewood popping, just silence thick enough to feel in my teeth. I stepped outside, heart racing, and glanced back only once. The door had stopped moving, closed tight, and I couldn't remember if I'd pulled it shut. I didn't sleep that night. I set my tent about half a mile away, off the ridge, but the fog pressed close, and the woods felt wrong, like I'd stumbled into some place I wasn't supposed to. Every twig snap made me sit up, flashlight trembling in my hand. By dawn I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Warm beds, food on the table. Maybe it was just old, preserved by the cold air. Maybe some hunter used it recently. My brain searched for any excuse. Still, I found myself heading back. The cabin looked different in daylight. Less hidden, but also less alive. Paint peeling, chimney leaning. No sign of anyone. My chest loosened until I opened the door again. The table was still set. The bread had gone stiff, beans crusted at the edges. The toy still sat where it had been. But it wasn't exactly the same. The rug at the stairs. Last night it had been bunched. Now it lay flat, perfectly straight. I tried not to think about it. I moved upstairs, each step slower than the last. In the first room, the boots were gone. Just a faint mud print on the wood floor where they had been. The brush still sat there, but the hair tangled and it was missing, pulled free. I didn't check the second room. I didn't need to. I stood in the hall, the silence pressing in so heavy I could hear my pulse in my ears. When I finally forced myself down the stairs, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the table, next to the bowl of beans, sat a second bowl, clean, dry. Waiting. I left then. I don't remember shutting the door, or how far I walked before I realized I was shaking. I just kept moving until the cabin was gone behind the trees. But it hasn't left me. It's been months now, and I still think about it every night. How the beds radiated heat, how someone had been there, and wasn't, how the place seemed to breathe between my visits, like a living thing reiterating itself, and how the door had closed behind me. Though I swear on my life I never touched it. I can't shake the thought that whoever lived there never really left. Maybe they're still inside, moving when no one's looking, sitting down to dinner, brushing their hair out of the comb, laying out bowls for guests who happen to stumble across the fog. Sometimes I wake in the dark with the smell of beans and smoke in my nose. My blanket's too warm, like someone else has just gotten up from them, and I wonder if I ever really left that cabin at all. I grew up in the lowlands of North Carolina, but I'd always heard people talk about the Appalachian Mountains like they were alive. Vast stretches of trees, valleys that swallowed sound, fog that rolled in so heavy. It felt like a living thing pressing against your skin. I never thought much of it until my friend Mark convinced me to take a weekend trip up there last fall. He had access to a cabin through a coworker who promised it was cozy, rustic, and private. What he failed to mention was how far off the main road it sat. By the time we finally got there, bumping along a mud-slick path that barely qualified as a road, the sun had already dropped behind the ridges. The place looked less like a retreat and more like something left behind. Paint weathered down to bare boards, a roof that sagged toward one corner, and a porch that groaned under our weight. The air smelled of rot and wet leaves. There wasn't another light for miles, just the endless black tree line and the hiss of rain dripping through branches. Inside, the cabin wasn't much better. One room with a stone fireplace, 2 worn couches, a kitchen in the corner, and a short hallway that led to a pair of bedrooms. No electricity, no service, just a lantern and a half-empty box of matches left on the counter, along with a note, "Pump out back for water, keep the door bolted at night." I remember laughing nervously at that, but Mark brushed it off. We tried to settle in. He opened a bottle of bourbon. I lit the lantern, and we played cards at the rickety table. The silence pressed in heavier than I expected. No cars, no dogs, not even crickets. The only sound was the rain tapping against the roof, dripping through where the wood had gone soft. Around midnight, when the lantern was starting to sputter, we heard it. 3 dull knocks at the back door. Not frantic, not loud, just steady. Mark froze with his glass halfway to his mouth. "Wind," he muttered, but his voice didn't sound convinced. We waited. A minute later, 3 knocks at the front door. I felt my chest tighten. Whoever it was hadn't just moved, they'd circled. The porch creaked faintly, like someone shifting their weight. Mark stood, trying to sound braver than he looked. Probably some hunter, lost in the woods. But when I pulled back the curtain a fraction of an inch, I caught a glimpse of a flashlight beam cutting through the trees. It swept once across the clearing, then vanished deeper into the woods, swallowed by the fog. Only our cabin didn't have electricity, and neither of us had thought to pack flashlights. I let the curtain fall. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed felt worse. My stomach knotted, like we'd just been noticed. Neither of us slept much that night. The morning didn't feel like morning. The fog hadn't lifted, just thickened into a wall of pale gray that pressed against the windows. I walked out to the pump to get water, and the woods seemed too still, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. Around the cabin, in the mud, were prints, boots, heavy-soled circling. Not just once, over and over, as if someone had walked laps around us for hours. I didn't say anything to Mark at first. He was already in a foul mood, muttering about how he couldn't wait to leave. But later, when he went to smoke on the porch, I saw him staring at the ground, pale. He'd noticed them too. We spent the day trying to distract ourselves, but it was useless. The silence kept pulling our attention back to the windows, to the tree line, to the thought of someone out there watching. Every creak of the cabin sounded like a footstep. By late afternoon, Mark suggested we pack up and head back down the mountain. I agreed instantly, but when he tried to start his truck, the engine just coughed and died. The battery was stone dead. That night, we lit the lantern again and sat in silence. The bourbon was gone, and the air felt thick with dread. I couldn't shake the memory of that flashlight beam vanishing into the fog. Around midnight, the knocking started again. This time it was softer, slower, like whoever it was knew we were listening. First at the back, then at the front, then at the side door that led out to the porch. Mark whispered, "Don't look." But I couldn't help it. I eased the curtain back just a sliver. No light this time, just a shadow standing a little too close to the tree line. I blinked, and it was gone. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so deep I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. We didn't sleep at all. By dawn, we'd decided to hike down the mountain, leave the truck, and come back with help later. But when we opened the door, something caught in my throat. The prints in the mud hadn't just circled the cabin this time. They led straight to the window where I'd been watching. The mud beneath the glass was churned, as if someone had stood there for hours, unmoving, staring in. I can't remember the hike down. My memory blurs into fog, mud, silence. I only remember the way Mark walked ahead of me without speaking, and how I kept glancing behind us, sure we were being followed. We made it back to the main road eventually, flagged down a truck, and got home. But even now, years later, I still wake up some nights to the sound of slow, deliberate knocking, and sometimes, when I pull back the curtain to reassure myself, I hesitate, because I know what I'll see if I stand there long enough. Someone watching, someone waiting, circling. I've always had this habit of driving into the Appalachians when life starts to feel too loud. The mountains give me silence, and I've convinced myself that silence means peace. That late autumn, the leaves were mostly gone. The branches black against the gray sky, and the air carried that damp bite that tells you winter isn't far. I was driving along a narrow road outside a town called Little Laurel when I saw it, a dirt path cutting through the trees, half hidden by overgrowth. I pulled over, grabbed my backpack, and decided to see where it went. The path wasn't long, maybe a quarter mile, and it led me to a clearing. In the center stood a cabin, slumped into itself, like it was tired of standing. The roof sagged, moss spread across the shingles, and the front steps bowed inward with rot. What surprised me most wasn't its condition, but how intact it was. Usually, cabins like that are gutted by weather, or kids looking for a place to drink. This one looked untouched. I don't know what made me push the door open. The wood groaned, and the smell hit first. Wet rot, mildew, and something sharp, like old photographs when you open a shoebox that's been sealed for years. Inside it was dim. The windows were smeared with dirt, and beams of weak light slanted through. The place was furnished in a way that unsettled me. A table with 2 chairs sat in the corner, their backs perfectly aligned. A thin mattress lay on the floor, indented as if someone had slept there last night. I stepped deeper in. The boards beneath me complained. That's when I noticed the wall. At first I thought it was just wallpaper peeling away, but as my eyes adjusted I realized it was photographs, dozens of them pinned in uneven rows. I moved closer. My stomach dropped. Every photo showed someone asleep. Different people, all ages, their faces slack, mouths parted. Some lay on couches, some in beds, others curled on the ground. And then the detail that made my throat dry out. A few of the photos were taken in this very cabin. I recognized the mattress in the corner, the cracked window pane, the same warped floorboard near the table leg. The people in those pictures weren't me, but they could have been. Just ordinary strangers, caught in the helplessness of sleep. I stood there too long, my ears stripped for movement, though all I heard was the faint tapping of rain starting outside. My hand brushed the photos, cool to the touch, edges curling from dampness. There was a door at the back of the cabin. It was locked, padlocked from my side. Something about that felt worse than the photographs. If it was locked from here, then whatever was beyond it wasn't meant to keep people out, but in. I backed out slowly. My boots sank into the mud as I left the clearing, and the cabin disappeared behind the veil of fog. That night, I checked into a rundown motel off Route 23. The place smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke, but at least it had 4 walls that weren't plastered with images of sleeping strangers. I dropped my bag, lay down, and told myself it was just a strange encounter, something I'd laugh about later. But sometime after midnight, when the rain was drumming on the window and the walls hummed with pipes, I woke to a sound I can still hear in my head. A single, sharp click, like the shutter of a camera. I sat up too fast, my heart punching against my ribs. The motel room was dark, just a smear of streetlight leaking past the curtains. I told myself it had been a pipe, or the heater, or even the echo of my dream. But I couldn't shake the weight of the sound. That crisp click had been too distinct. I forced myself to stay still, listening. My ears searched the silence until they ached. Nothing, just the rain. I turned on the lamp. The room looked ordinary. A cheap patterned bedspread, the TV bolted to the dresser, the faded landscape print on the wall. I checked the door. The chain was latched. The lock was turned. Still, I couldn't rest. I pulled my backpack closer. That's when I noticed something I swear hadn't been there before. Sticking out of the side pocket was a folded piece of glossy paper. My hands felt like ice as I slid it free. It was a photograph of me. I was lying on the very bed I was in now, the covers drawn halfway up my chest, my face slack with sleep. The photo wasn't grainy or old. It was crisp, recent. It had been taken in this room. I stared at it until my vision blurred. My stomach flipped as if I might vomit. Someone had been in here, close enough to lean over me, press a button and leave without waking me. My first thought was to run, but where? It was past 2 in the morning in a half-dead town. The idea of stepping out into the fog felt worse than staying put. I sat with my back against the headboard, every light in the room on, the photograph still clutched in my hand. My mind spiraled. Whoever had taken this, had they followed me from the cabin, or had the cabin just been a trap to let me know I was being watched? The night stretched, each hour dragging its weight across me. Around dawn I left. I didn't check out. I didn't even pack properly. I just stuffed what I could into my bag, threw the photo in the trash, and drove until the road blurred. It's been months since then. I don't talk about it, not really. People wouldn't believe me, or they'd try to explain it away. But I've stopped going into the mountains. I don't take back roads. I don't even pull over when I see a path that looks interesting. And at night, when the house is quiet, sometimes I'll jolt awake, convinced I've heard that same soft click in the dark. I don't own a camera. I never have, but lately, I've started noticing little things around my room, like the faint smell of damp wood, or the way my curtains shift when the windows are closed. I try not to look too closely, because I'm afraid, if I do, I'll find another photograph waiting for me. I told myself, it was just a hunting trip. That's what I said when I booked the one-night stay in the listing rundown cabin, secluded. I needed the quiet, the kind you only get when the road dies and the map stops naming places, except for a hollow and an old mill. The cabin sat 2 miles off Little Elk Road, down a hollow where the mist sits forever until the sun decides to move. The landlord's directions ended with, "You'll know it by the split rail and the leaning chimney." And he wasn't wrong. It leaned more than the chimney did. I arrived late afternoon with a pack that smelled of damp canvas and gun oil. The sun had thinned into the hollows and the trees were already whispering. The cabin itself was a box of tired wood, wet, dark beams, a porch that sagged in the middle, and a door that answered with a slow, tired creak. Inside, the air was the color of old tea. There was a stove with crusted ash, a bunk bed with a moth-eaten blanket, and a crooked table with an overturned chair. Someone had left a mug still wet with rainwater months ago. Dust had settled into circles where hands had once gripped it. Upstairs, the single room smelled of rot and mothballs. The mattress was a sack of springs. I stacked my gear, checked the rifle, laid out a flashlight on the table. I told myself the sounds, the foxes, the distant tractor, the slap of loose siding in the wind, would be enough company. There was something else, a heavy silence that wasn't empty so much as patient. It felt like a house holding its breath. Around dusk, a mist rolled in low and thick as old cloth. It swallowed the porch and made the world into shapes and close things. I ate cold beans out of a can and bought a little radio battery from my pack to hear a cracked AM station with someone reading obituary. When the rain began, it sounded like a slow hand on the roof, the kind of rain that hammers at memory. I slept early, or I tried. I told myself I would sleep like a man who'd walked 8 miles and stuffed his pockets with quiet. At 2 a.m. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth, and the radio a thin ghost in the background. I lay still because the house seemed listening. That's when I heard them. Not voices in the common sense, but low whispering, as if a dozen people sat pressed up against the outside walls and were conferring in a language made of breath. The sound came soft and circular, skimming along the clapboards, a moving seam of syllables that never landed. I'd heard people whisper in the woods before, camp stories, folks sharing secrets around a fire, but this had a shape to it, a rhythm that suggested intent. It raised hair along my forearms. I kept perfectly still, the kind of still where every creak in the house grows enormous. After a breath I rose, slow, and cracked open the door as quiet as I could. The porch light was burned out. My flashlight painted a small cone of wet grass and the leaning rail. The whispering stopped like somebody had turned a valve. Silence slammed down so fast it felt like a bruise. Outside, the fog was a wall. I swept the beam in a slow circle and nearly missed it. The grass around the cabin was pressed down in shallow, tidy circles, a dozen or so rings where blades bent toward the soil, as if someone had been kneeling and holding their hands there. The circles were damp with dew and smelled of earth and old sweat. My light glinted off a scrap of fabric, older, like a scarf, half buried in a ring of grass. I knelt and felt the compressed earth. It left a bit of wet soil under my thumbnail. The circles had been made recently. I checked the perimeter with the flashlight. The circles traced a faint ring close to the foundation, too regular to be animals and too organized for wind. Beyond them, The woods rose and swallowed tracks. I looked for prints and found none that made sense. No long lines of boot marks leading in or out, only the circles and the heavy, dense silence. I remember thinking then, very plainly, that whatever had been here wanted to stay quiet and wanted me to notice. I felt foolish, then, suddenly aware of 1,000 stupid things. That I was alone in a hollow with a shotgun and a dead porch light. That my truck was a mile away and would sound like a church bell if I tried to start it now. I shrugged into the jacket on instinct, and then, because I could not stand the house any longer, I walked the slow path to the truck. On the way I stopped and turned. The cabin's windows were dark, and for a moment, in the fog, one looked like a pair of eyes. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself a thing I often tell myself when the woods press too close. People in these parts keep secrets, not monsters. I flicked the flashlight higher, shook off a cold that wasn't just the night, and drove back to the cabin. The whispering had not returned, but I had the image of those leaning circles tucked into my gut like a stone. It felt like a bruise I hadn't noticed until I touched it. I convinced myself to stay until daylight. Men from Pine Hollow always say, "You don't run from the dark in the mountains, you learn its shape," a saying my uncle used to like. I'd driven here to be alone. Now loneliness felt heavier, like a coat pulled too tight. Morning came thin and gray. The fog retreated into the gullies, leaving the world wet and clean. Under sunlight, the circles didn't look mystical. They looked cold and ordinary. I felt a foolish relief at being able to see them plainly. I walked the perimeter again, this time with the light of day and a clearer head. The circles were a ring, 10 or 12 in number, pressed close to the cabin as if something had knelt to read the foundation like scripture. The soil within some rings was darker. Within one, closer to the back door, I found a smear of dried mud and a small round impression that matched the leather heel of my boot. My chest tightened so hard I had to breathe through my mouth. I looked at my boots where they'd been lined by the truck the night before and saw the familiar scuffs. I had cleaned them that afternoon before I came in. I could still feel the subtle hurt of a bruise where a lunging branch had caught me at the trailhead. The heel print at the ring matched the scuff perfectly. The thought came slow and absurd. Those prints were mine. I tried to account for it. Maybe I had walked the perimeter earlier and not remembered. Tiredness, a glass of bourbon, too much wind, but I kept throwing time backward and finding holes in it. I remembered sitting by the stove, opening my pack, putting a magazine in the rifle. I remembered laying down. After that, nothing precise. The memory turned into a smear like ring on a window. When memory refuses to settle, it feels like a small wound. Inside, the cabin betrayed other small betrayals. A drawer under the sink had been pulled out, and inside, a handful of items I hadn't packed. A faded Polaroid, its edges ragged, with a black and white photograph of the cabin itself taken from the same angle my porch light had shown the night before. There were figures in the photo, 3 shadowed shapes at the perimeter, turned away from the camera as if in prayer. One of them, my stomach clenched, wore a jacket with the same frayed cuff as my own. I flipped the photo over out of habit for any scribbled date or name. On the reverse, someone had scrawled in a shaky hand a year, and the initials, AK. The initials were mine. I found my lighter in the pocket of the jacket hanging by the stove. The lighter I always keep, dented and silver. My name wasn't on it, of course, but it was the make I carried. I felt a noise rise in my throat, like a laugh that wasn't pleased with its own timing. I began to search the cabin with a kind of deliberate slowness, as if haste might obliterate the fragile proof I was hunting for. Under the mattress, I found a small spiral notebook with entries in a cramped hand, dated back several months. The ink blurred in places where damp had kissed the paper, but the handwriting, thin, angular, matched the scrawl on the photo. The entries were fragmentary. Watching them sleep round the cabin. Say a name. Keep the names quiet. Another. He comes back. Same shoes, doesn't remember. The room smells of sleep. The pages folded into one another with a domestic violence of damp. There were lists of place names: Boone, Pine Hollow, Fairview, and then a sentence that stopped mid-sentence, as if the pen had been dropped. "We pray for the ones who forget. The house keeps them." My hands went cold. I could have left then. The sensible action would have been to drive out, go straight to the sheriff in Boone County, and tell a ridiculous story about pressure of the night. Instead, I sat on the floor and let the notebook drop open on my lap. Reading the cramped lines felt like watching someone else's sleep. The more I read, the more I recognized not the facts but the tone, the quiet imperative to remember, the gentle cruelty of keeping something going, because stopping would mean looking at what had been done. The rest of the day brought nothing decisive, only shallow confirmations. A neighbor, in a truck on Little Elk Road, a woman with hands like someone who sorts hay, told me the cabin had been used by a group long ago. People who held vigils for those lost to river and road, she said, and others had used the place to take care of men who returned from the war different. Her eyes narrowed when I mentioned the kneeling at the perimeter. "Sometimes folk think if they circle a house, it keeps what's in the house from leaving," she said. "Sometimes it keeps people from remembering. Depends on what you want to hold." The words were not neat and did not explain. They landed like wet leaves. That night, I left the cabin. I drove until the road turned unfamiliar, and the outlines of the ridges were only suggestions. I slept in a motel off Highway 321 with the television on low and woke more times than seemed human. I have gone back since too many times and not enough, and each time I find small new accretions. The jacket I recognize like an old friend left on a peg. The Polaroid, with a new shadow in the ring. A line in the notebook that matches handwriting. I cannot remember learning to write. I have tried to tell myself 1,000 rational things: sleepwalking, a prank, a sloppy landlord, but the bruise of it is under my skin. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear whispering on wood, and the rhythm of it feels like a name being folded into the ground. I do not have answers. I have only an outline of events with ragged edges where the memory should be whole and a photo with my initials on the back. The thing that clings the worst is a small stubborn certainty. When the kneeling happens around a house, something else is being kept safe, and something else is being hidden. I have the lighter in my pocket right now. I can feel the dent on its side. I have not stopped waking at 2 a.m. Yes, and sometimes, in the guttering dark of my own bedroom, I think I can hear a dozen people speaking very close to the walls.
I hadn't been back to the Appalachians in years. My friend Mark invited me to spend a long weekend at his family's cabin, tucked deep in the hollows of West Virginia. He said it was quiet, isolated, and perfect for clearing my head. I was worn down from city life, and the thought of fog-draped mountains and wood smoke felt like something I needed more than I realized. The drive-in was enough to make me uneasy. The road narrowed the higher we climbed, the asphalt breaking apart into gravel. Fog pressed in thick against the headlights, swallowing the turns before I had time to see them. I passed old mailboxes, leaning crookedly on splintered posts, some with names faded to smudges. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was gone, and the woods around us were black and restless with crickets. The cabin was older than I expected. The wood siding had gone silver with age, and the porch sagged slightly toward the slope. Inside, the air carried a faint smell of mildew and ash, like rain-soaked wood that had never fully dried. The walls were cluttered with hunting trophies and family photos, sepia-toned men in overalls, women in bonnets, blank stares that didn't follow you so much as press down on you. Mark seemed comfortable enough. He dropped his duffel near the couch, cracked a beer, and turned on a lamp that filled the room with a weak yellow glow. I tried to relax, telling myself it was just an old cabin, but when it came time to sleep, I wandered the narrow hall until I found the small bedroom he'd said I could use. The room was cramped, with a low ceiling, and a single bed shoved against the wall. A crooked dresser leaned opposite the bed, its drawers swollen from humidity. When I shut the door, the first thing I noticed was the wood on the inside. Deep, uneven scratches cut into it. Not small ones, either. These grooves had torn through the finish, raking down in ragged trails. At first, I thought they looked like the marks of an animal, but the more I stared, the less that made sense. They weren't clustered at the bottom. They were spread across the middle, as if someone had clawed from the inside out, desperate to leave. I ran my fingers over them. The cuts were old but unmistakable. I stepped back, unsettled. Later, when I mentioned it to Mark, he didn't look surprised. He just shrugged and said, almost casually, "That's why we don't lock the doors anymore." Then he chuckled, as if it were nothing. But lying in that room, with the cabin settling around me, and the fog pressing against the windows, I couldn't stop imagining the sound of those scratches being the frantic drag of nails against wood, the muffled thud of fists. I tried not to think about it, but the smell of wet wood and old sweat hung heavy, and every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone on the other side of that door, trapped. By the time sleep came, it was thin and restless, and I woke to silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing into my chest. Something about this place was wrong. I knew it then, but I didn't ask more questions. Not yet. The next day, fog lay thick over the valley. It clung to the treetops, making the world beyond the porch vanish into gray. We spent the morning fishing at a nearby creek, and for a while it felt almost normal. But the image of those scratches never left me. Back at the cabin that evening, I found myself wandering the hall again. There was another door at the far end, one I hadn't noticed before. The knob was tarnished burnt, and when I tried it, it didn't turn. Locked. I asked Mark about it while we ate dinner. He paused, knife halfway through a piece of cornbread, then shook his head. "Storage," he said quickly, and changed the subject. His tone had an edge I hadn't heard before. That night, the silence returned. Mark had passed out on the couch, and I was alone in the hall staring at that locked door. The scratches on mine seemed worse in the dim light, almost alive in their chaos. I pressed my ear against the locked door at the end of the hall. At first, nothing. Just the thick quiet of a house set too deep in the woods. Then, faint. So faint I thought it might be my own pulse. I heard something shift, a soft scrape, like wood dragging against wood. I backed away, my skin prickled, and for the first time, I realized how cut off we were. The road was miles of gravel and fog, no neighbors in shouting distance. If something was in that room, or had been, no one would know. I barely slept again. When morning came, Mark acted as though nothing was wrong, humming to himself as he made coffee. But I noticed how he avoided the hall entirely, never glancing toward the end where that locked door waited. On my last day, I couldn't stop myself. While Mark carried wood in from outside, I went to the locked door with a butter knife from the kitchen. The lock was old, simple. It gave with a stubborn click. The smell hit me first, stale, suffocating. The room was small, bare, just a mattress on the floor. The walls were marked too, not just the door. Every surface bore the same desperate scratches, layered over each other until the wood looked flayed. On the mattress lay a blanket, stained dark in patches that had never been washed out. I froze there, unable to move, until Mark's footsteps creaked on the porch. I shut the door, shoved the knife into my pocket, and pretended nothing had happened. He didn't notice, or maybe he did, and just didn't care. I left that afternoon, the drive down the mountain, long and sun. I didn't ask him again about the scratches. I still think about them though. About the smell in the room, the way the marks weren't random but layered like someone had worn their own hands down to nothing trying to get out. And I think about what Mark said, his voice flat and careless. That's what, we don't lock the doors anymore. I don't know who or what was in there. I only know that whatever they went through left marks that the wood still remembers, even if Mark pretends not to. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear that soft scrape again, not in the cabin, but in my own head, like something waiting behind a locked door I'll never open all the way. I wasn't supposed to be out there that long. The plan was simple. Take a late-season hike up through one of the lesser-used trails outside of Clay County, cut across a ridge, and make it back down before nightfall. But the snow came early that year.
By the time I realized how quickly it was falling, the trail was already buried, and every tree looked the same. I'd left my pack too light. No tent, no real supplies, because I thought it would just be a day trip. By dusk, the wind had picked up, the woods turned gray, and I was running on instinct. My boots were soaked, my fingers numb inside half-frozen gloves. Then I saw it. Just a shape through the veil of snow and fog. A cabin. It sat low in a hollow, dark against the white hills, its roof sagging under the weight of ice. There was no smoke from the chimney, no footprints around it, no sign of anyone living there. But the door wasn't locked. Inside it smelled of damp wood and something sour, like mold and old food long forgotten. The floor creaked under my weight, and the air felt colder than it should have been. Dust lay on the furniture, an old rocking chair, a table with one leg braced by stacked magazines. Against the far wall was a cot, its blanket stiff with mildew. I was too cold to care. I closed the door, shoved a chair against it, and sat down to thaw out. My breath puffed white in front of me. That's when I noticed the journal. It was lying on the table, half buried under a yellowed map of the Appalachians. The cover was cracked leather, the pages curled and warped from damp. I opened it, expecting hunting notes or maybe some kind of old log. Instead, I found frantic writing. The first entries were almost normal. Dates from about 2 winters ago, talking about trapping, small game, and weather conditions. Then the handwriting changed. Words slanted, pressed hard into the paper. Lines ran off the margins. It started with small comments. Saw someone standing near the tree line. But when I waved, they didn't move. Something's wrong here. I can feel eyes on me. A few pages later, the tone had unraveled completely. It waits until dark. I know it does. Every time I look out the window, I see nothing. But I hear the snow shift. The last page was the worst. The ink was smeared, letters trailing down the paper like the writer's hand had been shaking violently. The sentence ended without finishing. It's at the window now. I shut the journal, heart pounding. My eyes went to the windows of the cabin. They were frosted over, but I could still see the pale light of evening pressing against the glass. I told myself it was just some man's paranoia. Maybe he'd gone stir-crazy out here alone, snowbound like I was. Maybe he'd written it for attention, or maybe not at all. But as the night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling. The woods went silent in that peculiar way they do in deep winter, where even the owls don't call. The wind dropped, and the silence pressed heavy against the walls. I lay on the cot, journal beside me, eyes half closed, telling myself I was safe. Then, just as I started to drift, I heard it. A sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Crunch. Slow. Deliberate. Footsteps in the snow. They moved along the outside wall of the cabin. Steady, pausing between each step. Not hurried. Not careless. Just slow. As if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to hear. I froze. My chest barely moved with breath. The crunching circled toward the window, and then it stopped. I don't know how long I sat upright on that cot, holding my breath, staring at the window. The frost was so thick I couldn't see out, but I swore I saw a shadow move past, blocking the faint moonlight for just a second. I told myself I was imagining it, that the journal had gotten in my head, but my hands were trembling. My throat felt like it was closing. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The silence returned. No more footsteps. Finally, exhaustion pulled me under, though my sleep was thin and broken. When dawn seeped gray through the windows, I forced myself up. My body ached from the cold. I didn't want to open that door, but staying inside felt worse. I pushed the chair away and cracked it open. The snow outside was knee-deep fresh powder. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, a few feet from the cabin, I noticed the prints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots. Heavy ones, like a man's, leading up to the cabin, and stopping directly beneath the window where I'd lain awake. But there were no tracks leading away. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the ground. The prints didn't make sense. They looked pressed deep, like whoever made them had been standing there a long time. Just standing, watching. I backed inside, shut the door,
and felt a wave of nausea roll through me. My mind started clawing for explanations. Maybe the wind covered the exit tracks. Maybe snow filled them in overnight. But I didn't believe it. The edges of the prints were too sharp, too fresh. I grabbed the journal again. My hands shook as I flipped back through it, as if the writer's desperation might tell me what to do. One line caught me this time. One I hadn't noticed before, scribbled in the margin. It wants me inside. The cabin keeps me still, keeps me waiting. That's when it comes. My skin prickled. I suddenly felt like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare, one they hadn't woken up from. I didn't stay another night. I packed what little I had, shoved the journal back onto the table, and forced myself out into the woods. Every step away from that cabin felt like tearing against some invisible weight, like I wasn't supposed to leave. The storm had passed. The sky was pale and open. I found a deer path, then a frozen creek that led me downhill. Hours later, I stumbled into a logging road and flagged down a truck. The driver asked where I'd been, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I just said I got turned around in the snow. That was 3 years ago. Even now, sometimes in the dead of winter, I'll wake in the middle of the night, certain I hear it again. That slow, steady crunch of footsteps in the snow outside my window, and I never ever look.
When my uncle passed, no one in the family wanted to deal with his old cabin in the Appalachian hills. He hadn't lived there in years, and by the time it came into my hands, most of the family just wanted it sold. I drove down in late October, when the fog was thick and low in the valleys, rolling across the winding roads like it had weight to it. The cabin sat a few miles outside a town called Burnsville, though calling it a town was generous, just a gas station, a post office, and a row of shuttered stores. The road to the cabin was narrow and muddy from days of rain, and the trees hung over like they were closing me in. The place looked smaller than I remembered. Dark wood siding streaked with green shingles sagging in the middle. When I unlocked the front door, the smell hit me first. Damp rot, old ash, something sour that clung to the back of my throat. Inside was exactly what you'd expect from a cabin left to rot. Old plaid furniture, with stuffing pushing through seams. A wood stove crusted with soot, wallpaper curling at the edges. But there was also a silence that pressed on me harder than I liked, broken only by the occasional drip of rain from somewhere in the ceiling. I spent the day picking through piles of junk my uncle had left behind. Boxes of tools, rusted hunting gear, a stack of old newspapers from the 80s. The work was slow, but it kept my mind busy. It was that night, sleeping in the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, when I noticed something strange. The room felt off, smaller than it should have been. I couldn't place it at first, but the bed pushed against the far wall left an uneven gap, like the wall had been built out past where it should naturally meet the frame. When I pressed on it, it sounded hollow. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the bed aside, exposing a section of wall that didn't quite line up with the floorboards. With enough force, one of the panels gave. Behind it was darkness, a crawl space, narrow, damp, with just enough room for someone to slide inside. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of storage space, but the air that leaked out smelled like mildew mixed with something rancid, like spoiled food. I pulled my flashlight from my bag and shined it in. That's when I saw it. An old mattress, stained dark in the middle, flattened from use. Beside it, a pile of empty tin cans, labels curling with age. Beans, peaches, stew, some chewed open, not even cut with a can opener. And then the detail that rooted me to the floor, a hole in the wall, right at head height, drilled clean through. I traced it with the light. The hole faced directly into the bedroom, straight toward where the bed sat. I backed out, heart pounding. My uncle hadn't mentioned this space, and from the look of it, someone had lived here. Recently or not, I couldn't tell. But that night, as I lay in the same bed facing that wall, all I could think about was what it would have been like for someone to lie there, in the crawl space, inches away, staring through that hole, watching. The silence of the cabin felt heavier than ever, and though I tried, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to clear the crawl space out. I told myself it was just an old habit of my uncle's, some strange storage project, maybe even a place he used to hide liquor. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I pulled everything out slowly, setting the rusted cans in a pile on the porch. They rattled and clinked with hollow echoes. The mattress was harder. It was damp, stiff at the edges, and left dark streaks on the floor when I dragged it. Underneath it were scraps of paper, wrappers, torn magazines, and what looked like the corner of a notebook page. The handwriting was shaky, just a few words. He doesn't hear me. He never hears me. The words sank into me like ice water. I shoved the page into my jacket and backed out. I kept telling myself it was just some drifter, someone passing through who found a dry place to sleep. But the handwriting, the neatness of the cans stacked against the wall, it felt too deliberate. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom. I unrolled a blanket in the front room, near the wood stove, but no matter where I lay, I felt the cabin pressing in, as if every wall had a hole I couldn't see. At some point in the night, I heard it, just a creak, faint, like weight shifting on old boards. I froze, straining to listen. The wind outside was low, whistling through the trees. The creak came again, closer this time, from the back of the house. I held my breath. After a long stretch of silence, I told myself it was the house settling, nothing more. Still, I stayed awake until the pale gray light of dawn seeped through the windows. By the third day, I'd had enough. I packed my tools and drove back into Burnsville, asking around at the gas station if anyone knew about squatters near the cabin. The clerk just shrugged. Plenty of folks disappear up there. Some never come back down. That night, I slept in my car outside the cabin, engine off, windows fogging with my breath. Sometime past midnight, I saw movement, a faint glow from inside the cabin. A flashlight, sweeping slowly across the front room. My heart hammered so hard, I thought it might shake the glass. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched that dim circle of light drift across the walls, then vanish. By dawn, the cabin was still again. But when I went inside, the false wall panel I'd pried open had been pushed shut. I left everything behind that morning. The mattress, the cans, even my uncle's tools. I drove until the mountains disappeared in the rear view. It's been years since then. The cabin was sold off cheap, last I heard. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners ever found that crawl space, if they noticed the hole in the wall, lined up perfectly with the bed. I still think about that page I kept, folded at the back of a drawer in my desk. The shaky handwriting, the words etched in my mind. He doesn't hear me. He never hears me. And sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I catch myself staring at the shadows in the corner of my room, wondering if someone is there, silent, waiting, watching, just close enough to touch, if I'd only listen. I was driving through the Blue Ridge, on a stretch of road I'd never meant to take. Rain had been falling all afternoon, steady and cold, and by dusk it had turned into something heavier. Sheets of water that blurred the bends and drop-offs until every turn felt like a guess. My wipers were beating themselves to death, trying to keep up. The little pull-offs and gas stations I'd passed were all shuttered. The kind of hollow mountain towns where most folks leave after high school and never look back. By nightfall, I'd lost service completely. My GPS cut out in the middle of a dirt road that looked more like a trail. The mud sucked at my tires until finally the incline won. My car slid sideways and buried itself nose-deep in a rut. The engine whined, then coughed into silence. That's when I noticed a dull light through the trees. It was faint, a warm square glowing out of the mist. I grabbed my jacket, pulled the hood tight, and trudged toward it, slipping in mud that smelled like rot. My boots squelched. Every time I stopped, the woods pressed in with a silence so heavy it made me move again. The cabin sat on a small rise, a crooked thing made of weather-beaten logs, roof sagging in the middle like an old horse. Smoke drifted from the chimney. The air carried a smell of wet wood and something faintly metallic. I hesitated before knocking, but the storm left me no choice. The door opened with a low groan, and a man filled the frame. He was wiry, with gray hair tucked under a cap, and eyes that looked sharp despite the creases in his face. He didn't smile. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was flat, but not unkind. I nodded, dripping on his porch. "Storm's not letting up. You won't get far tonight." He stepped aside, and I followed him in. The cabin smelled of old ash, damp wool, and something sweet, almost spoiled. The single room was dimly lit by a lantern on the table. An iron stove clicked as it heated, and the walls were lined with shelves of jars, some empty, some filled with cloudy liquid, and things I couldn't make out. "You can sleep here," he said, pointing toward a small room in the back. "Bed's clean enough, but keep the curtains shut. Best you do that." I tried to ask why, but he only shook his head, as if the matter wasn't up for discussion. The room had a narrow cot, a wool blanket, and a single window that looked out toward the tree line. The curtains were old lace, yellowed with age. I pulled them closed, though my hands lingered a second longer than they should have. Outside, I thought I heard movement in the wet leaves. That night, the storm beat against the cabin like fists on a coffin lid. I couldn't sleep. The blanket was scratchy, and the smell of mildew clung to it. Around midnight, I thought I heard the front door creak. A floorboard groaned, then silence again, so heavy it made the storm sound far away. I told myself I was imagining it, but sometime around 3, I woke to the feeling of being watched. My mouth was dry, my chest tight. The curtain glowed faintly with the reflection of the lantern outside. Against all better judgment, I stood and pulled the fabric back an inch. At the edge of the trees stood 3 figures, perfectly still, perfectly aligned. Their shapes were dark against the fog, facing the cabin, not moving, not swaying, just there. Behind me, the man's whisper cracked through the dark. "Don't let them know you saw." I froze. My fingers clenched the curtain, heart hammering so loud I was sure those shapes could hear it. I let the fabric fall back into place, but the outline of the figures stayed burned behind my eyelids. The man was standing in the doorway of the room. I hadn't heard him approach. His face was half in shadow, jaw tight. He didn't speak again, just turned and walked back toward the main room. The boards creaked under his weight, then settled. I sat on the cot until my legs went numb, every muscle braced for something I couldn't name. The storm outside had weakened, leaving only a soft patter on the roof. It was quieter now, too quiet, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. When I finally stepped back into the main room, he was sitting at the table with the lantern turned low. His hands were folded in front of him, his eyes lifted slowly to mine. "You should get some rest," he said. "They don't bother folks who don't bother them." His words settled like a stone in my chest. I wanted to ask who they were, but the weight in his tone told me it wasn't a question I wanted answered. The hours crawled by until the first smear of gray daylight seeped through the cracks in the shutters. I didn't sleep at all. When I stepped outside, the air was heavy with damp earth. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood empty, silent, no footprints in the mud, no sign anyone had been there. The man came out behind me, squinting toward the forest as if checking something only he understood. "Road'll be clearer once the sun's up. You can walk to town, maybe 15 miles east. Better than staying here." I thanked him, though the words felt thin. He didn't invite me back, didn't look at me again. As I walked away, I glanced once over my shoulder. The cabin sat crooked against the mist, smoke thinning from the chimney. The curtains in the small back room fluttered slightly, though the air was still. I made it to a town by late afternoon, mud up to my knees, throat raw from the damp. Nobody believed me when I mentioned the figure. They smiled politely, said I must have been dreaming, exhausted from the storm, but I know what I saw. 3 shapes standing dead still at the tree line, watching. I can still feel the way the man's whisper clung to the air, like it wasn't just a warning, but a rule he'd lived by for years. Bitch. Sometimes, late at night, when I close my own curtains at home, I catch myself peeking through the fabric, just a sliver, just enough to see. And for a second, I swear I feel the same weight pressing in from the dark. The fear isn't in what I saw. It's in the part I'll never understand, and how long they stood there before I left, and whether they're still standing there now, waiting for someone else to notice. I had driven farther into the mountains than I probably should have. The road thinned to gravel and then to little more than packed dirt, winding deeper into a stretch of the Appalachians where fog collected like it had weight. I'd been hiking all day following an old trail that cut through the hollows, and by the time the sun started slipping behind the ridgeline, I realized I wouldn't make it back to the car before dark. That's when I found the cabin. It was tucked back among sycamores and poplars, half hidden by vines. The wood was gray with age, roof sagging, but it was still standing. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Yet when I stepped up onto the porch, the boards gave a hollow groan beneath my boots, like they remembered every weight that had crossed them. The door wasn't locked. Just a simple handle that turned without resistance. I hesitated. Growing up, I'd heard too many stories about squatters, meth labs, or worse, hidden in places like this. But the woods were thick, the fog was rolling in, and the air smelled like rain. I told myself I'd just use it for shelter, one night only. Inside, the air was close and damp. Mold crawled along the seams of the walls, and dust lay heavy on the floor. The place was one large room with a stone fireplace, a few shelves nailed to the walls, and some old furniture. A cot in the corner sagged under its own weight. A wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the center of the room, their surfaces warped from years of damp air. I set my pack down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and tried not to think about how the air seemed to cling to my skin. The silence outside pressed in. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves, just the thick hush of fog and distant dripping water. I noticed small details that unsettled me, though I tried to push them aside. A mug on the shelf, rim chipped but clean, as if it had been used recently. A pile of ashes in the fireplace, faint but not yet washed to gray. And on the table, a folded piece of paper weighted by a rock. I lifted the rock and opened it. The handwriting was faint and scrawled, hard to read. "Don't stay after dark." I stared at it for a long time, my chest tightening, before forcing a laugh. It could have been anything. Some old prank, a leftover warning from years ago. Still, I put the note back exactly as I'd found it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin settled in my chest like a weight. The roof ticked as the temperature dropped. Once, I swore I heard something move on the porch, a shifting step on rotten wood, but when I sat up and listened, it was gone. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off just before dawn, because when the light finally broke through the cracks in the boards, pale and cold, I woke with a start. Something was wrong. The chair from the table, one of the 2 warped wooden ones, was no longer at the table. It was sitting just a few feet from my cot, turned squarely to face me. I hadn't moved it. My skin prickled cold. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I had shifted it without remembering, but there was no reason. I lay frozen, staring at it, until I heard the faintest groan of floorboards near the far corner of the cabin. Not a crash, not even a step, just the whisper of wood under weight, as though something had just slipped away. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, the silence pressing harder than ever. I wasn't alone in that cabin. The first thing I did was scan the room. There was nowhere obvious for someone to hide. The cabin was one square box of rotting timber. No closets, no second room. The fireplace was empty but for the faint smell of char. I even pulled back the sagging cot, half expecting to see eyes peering out from the shadows beneath. Nothing. The silence hung heavy, broken only by my own breathing. But I couldn't shake the sound I'd heard, the soft complaint of boards as if weight had shifted only moments earlier. I forced myself up, grabbed my pack, and moved toward the door. My hand froze on the knob. It was wet, slick with condensation or something else. I wiped it on my pants, unsettled. Outside, the fog was still thick, swallowing the trees in pale gray. Visibility barely stretched 10 feet. I didn't leave right away. Something kept me there. Maybe curiosity, maybe fear. Instead, I circled the cabin. The ground was soft with last night's rain, mud clinging to my boots. That's when I noticed them. Footprints. They weren't mine. The treads were different, flatter, older. They led around the cabin, close to the walls, and then vanished into the brush. Some were fresher, edges still crisp. Whoever had made them had been there not long before I woke up. I told myself to go. Just shoulder my pack and walk out, follow the trail back down to the car. But I didn't. Something about the chair gnawed at me. When I stepped back inside, the light had shifted. Sunbeams cut thin lines across the dust, and that's when I saw it. Something carved into the wood of the chair itself, faint but deliberate. Letters. Sit still. My throat went dry. The words had been etched deep, the grooves dark with age. My mind tried to reason it out. Maybe kids, maybe some cruel joke, but the thought of waking to that chair turned toward me, facing me as I slept, was too much. I didn't sit. I didn't even breathe right. Instead, I backed away, every creak of the floorboards like an alarm in the quiet. I left then. I walked out into the fog, following the faint outline of the trail, heart hammering, as though something was right behind me. For miles, the forest felt wrong. Branches snapped somewhere deep in the trees. Once, I swear I heard breathing behind me, steady and slow, but when I turned, there was only fog and silence. By the time I reached my car, the sun was climbing, burning the mist off the ridges. I drove until the mountains fell behind me. The image of that chair etched into my mind as sharply as the words carved into its back. I never told anyone. Not really. If I bring it up, I make it sound like a strange dream, some trick of exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes, when I wake too early in the morning, with light just breaking at the edge of the blinds, I half expect to see it again, that old wooden chair, pulled up close, turned toward my bed, waiting.